Hello and welcome to the Fantasy Life Show. It is the time to give away some awards, everybody. Recap what went right, what went wrong throughout an eventful 2024-2025 season. And accordingly, myself, Ian Hartitz, and Fantasy Life's finest Director of Analytics, Dwain, The Rock McFarland. We're here to get some love and maybe even a little bit of hate, Dwain.
Yeah. I mean, look, award season is the perfect time to give out, some attaboys, some good pats on the back, but also, we got to reflect on things that, maybe we could have done a little bit better, Ian. So yeah, we're going to hit on both sides of it. The data doesn't lie, so we just follow that.
We got some Sheeshies, we got some utilizations. Maybe you can workshop those names for yourself if you want. Tomorrow we'll be going through again more of the traditional fantasy MVP awards and things of that nature. But enough of that, Dwain. Let's get into it with the Sheeshies of the 2024 season. As always, the Sheesh Report presented by our friends over at Mike's Hard Lemonade. And for those new to the concept, everything about Sheesh is just a sort of tilting, near miss, beyond the box score moments that simply left fantasy managers sitting there saying, you guessed it, Sheesh. So Dwain, want to kick things off with, kind of the Eagles RB special, because back-to-back years now, we have seen the running back finish awfully high. And this year it was, in fact, number one, Saquon Barkley, with 11 instances of being tackled down at the 1 yard line and then not scoring a touchdown on the same drive. So yes, that is the total throughout the year. Happened on the same drive a couple times with Dwain. 9 separate drives overall for Saquon. Truly was 3 feet away. 9 different occasions from, again, scoring many more touchdowns. So DeAndre Swift, runner-up for the second year in a row, this time with the Bears, last year with the Eagles. He had 6 such sheeshes. And then also Brian Robinson, Bucky Irving, Chuba Hubbard, David Montgomery, and Devon Achane with 5. But really is incredible, Dwain, when you have a running back, again, literally clear 2,000 yards rushing and still lose some meat on the bone.
Yeah, absolutely. And my big takeaway from this list is, trying to predict which ball carriers are going to get the rock inside the 5 yard line. It's not very easy, Ian. Like Devon Achane on this list, people said, too small. Bucky Irving, another guy that people thought was too small to be getting these carries. But back to your winner, Saquon Barkley. Yes, we had the tush push still in play, and that certainly cost him some points, to your point. But I think the big takeaway is, 45% of the Eagles' carries inside the 5 yard line still went to Saquon Barkley, even with Jalen Hurts around. And it turns out when you have a good offensive line, you can still make some other big plays like Saquon did. You play on a quality offense. I know passing game hasn't been that good here lately, guys, but we know it's a good run attack. Man, you can still overcome a lot of things, and that's what Saquon did. But to your point, man, could have been an even bigger season. Saquon finished 10th in the league, though, with 1.1 carries inside the 5 yard line per game.
Touchdowns are pretty fantastic in fantasy. We want those. But again, when you rack up as many yards as Saquon, sometimes they just don't matter as much as you would think. Would have been the PPR RB9 last season without scoring a single touchdown. Luckily, he still managed to get about 15 to his name. So we'll also shout out Amon-Ra St. Brown, Justin Jefferson. They led all wide receivers with 3 such sheeshes. And Jaden Daniels actually led all quarterbacks with 3 in his own right. So again, these included, Dwain, both just regularly getting tackled down at the 1 yard line and those brutal fumbles when they get down there, have the ball go out the back of the end zone. Man, just some absolutely horrible stuff. Yes, I am talking to you, Jonathan Taylor, for that one. So those were down at the 1 yard line leaderboard, but also join an equally sheeshy category. Unrealized air yards. As always, we are simply measuring the distance that the ball was thrown between the quarterback and the intended target on incomplete passes. So as much as we want to say, hey, look at the difference in targets and receptions, we know that, again, guys like Calvin Ridley, for example, maybe giving it away, had a bit more, air yards left on the table than, say, Wan'Dale Robinson. So with that in mind, our top 6 wide receivers, and yes, it is going to be led by the Titans wide receiver 1, Calvin Ridley, with over 1,000 unrealized air yards. He was the only man to have 4 digits of them. Rome Odunze, Cortland Sutton, Malik Neighbors, Marvin Harrison Jr., and Brian Thomas Jr., though, rounding out the top 6. So really, Dwayne, Calvin Ridley, he had to go from Trevor Lawrence and Jacksonville, not always being on the same page, to the Will Levis and Mason Rudolph experience. And yeah, man, wasn't great.
Yeah, and I mean, just a player that we're seeing work downfield more here recently. And that's fine. Like 16 yards average depth of target. Like you could still come away with points on that. But we saw the same thing happen to DeAndre Hopkins last year in this offense with Will Levis. So one of the big things with the utilization score is we also look at catchable air yards, which is really getting back to the same thing you're doing here, which is it's kind of the opposite, right, of the unrealized air yards, because a lot of them end up being not catchable. So with Ridley, you do have to wonder, though, like, is it just the quarterback play or is it something in his game? I don't know, because to your point, he did it with Trevor Lawrence, turns around, does it again with Will Levis. Overall, I typically still want to lean into these types of players that can earn the air yards, they can earn the targets. Calvin Ridley still fits that, but man, 2 Sheesh years in a row.
Was fourth last year as well. So yeah, quarterbacks certainly have something to do with it. But again, these can be drops as well. So not explicitly, just always the quarterback's fault out here. So did want to shout out Rome Odunze, because Dwayne, you did mention the kind of catchable pass element of it. And per some data over at Fantasy Points, Odunze was dealing with more uncatchable air yards than just about anyone out there. So did see the Bears go ahead and hire Mr. Ben Johnson away from Detroit. I'm sure Rome's going to have to get that right arm loose for a couple trick plays here or there, but hopefully we also see him just get maybe just some more manageable targets here and there instead of everything being more of these chance balls down the sideline.
Yeah, for sure. And it will be interesting to see, how does Ben Johnson integrate all these weapons into the offense. We know he's going to have a plan for that. And I agree with you, finding a way to maybe, we don't know, Rome might be their best run after the catch player. They have DJ Moore, pretty good in that area in his own right. I think we all agree Keenan's a fine separator on the inside, knows how to find those zones and get those first downs. But if you're wanting to get the ball into someone's hands and let big things happen, I have to think that Rome has got to be at the top of the list for Ben Johnson.
Obviously, Keenan, one of the more interesting potential free agents out there as well. We'll see if he does come back to Chi-Town or not. So, again, guys, that was the unrealized air yards leaderboard, trying to quantify, again, just the total missed downfield opportunities throughout a season. But we have another instance of receivers getting some separation downfield, having a chance to record a big play, and then those pesky referees taking it away from us. It is the defensive pass interference yards leaderboard. Was tracking this throughout the year. And yes, guys, there was a king who rose above all else, and his name is Justin Jefferson with a league high 171 yards drawn from DPI penalties. However, one of my favorite fun facts from last season is in second place, not Jamar Chase, not CeeDee Lamb, Noah freaking Brown, Dwain, out of the Commanders, sitting there with 158. Alec Pierce, Darnell Mooney, and Jordan Addison rounding out the top 5. So yes, you are correct. The Vikings had far more DPI penalty, just yardage drawn throughout the year than any other team. But it's funny seeing guys like Noah Brown and Alec Pierce on the list as well. But yeah, goes to show you, Dwayne, that as great as Jay Jetta's season was out there with Sam Darnold, honestly could have had even more yards.
I love all of the Sheesh awards, but this is one of my favorites because I love to look at this one because we don't capture this in the utilization score, because ultimately this counts as a penalty, right? And it gets negated from the play-by-play data in the way we have it, but the way we pull it in, it would cause issues elsewhere, right? To try to include plays with penalties, things like that. So maybe we'll figure out a way to just have it in there for the penalties on the pass interference and stuff like that. But I love looking at this one. Obviously, Justin Jefferson, already awesome, but to sit here and say that he could have been even better, and that and it makes sense, right? When you're covering Justin Jefferson, you just got to do whatever you can, Ian, to try to guard him. I don't know about you, but if I feel like the guy is going to get by me and it might be a touchdown, or I can just take the 15-yard penalty, sometimes it just makes sense to take the 15 or the 5-yard penalty instead of giving up the touchdown. And we know that Justin Jefferson's really good at putting the opposing defender in the grinder with that route running prowess.
Also, again, funny seeing Alec Pierce here in third, but hey, you look up at the end of the season, I felt like it was a Fugazi throughout the year, Dwayne, seeing him leading the Colts in receiving yards, but it happened. End of the year, not Michael Pittman, not Josh Downs, not A.D. Mitchell, Alec Pierce, Colts wide receiver 1. And again, also shout out Darnell Mooney and Jordan Addison, each of whom, during various stretches of the season really did start to warrant that kind of upside wide receiver 2 consideration in Fantasyland. Obviously, with a bit more help from those Zebras, could have had even bigger years. But that was our DPI drawn leaderboard. Now, Dwain, for our last Sheesh award category, wanted to go through some quarterbacks who were just dealing with the most overall drops. And this one wasn't exactly as clear-cut as the other three because, as we know, with drops, you can quantify them in quite a few different ways. So using the data from PFF, we can say, hey, Aaron Rodgers had the most total raw drops on the season. 39 separate passes were dropped. We had Justin Herbert at 28, Joe Burrow 27, Bo Nix at 25, the only other quarterbacks even close there. Meanwhile, in terms of drop rate, we had Anthony Richardson at 11.3%, highest in the league. Daniel Jones at 10%, only other quarterback in the double digits. And yeah, Anthony Richardson, I'm sorry, man. I wish they would hold on to that ball, and some of those were egregious. Also, maybe every single pass doesn't need to be 99 miles per hour. Just saying. I'm not a quarterback, but, maybe just my 2 cents there. But finally, Dwain, the one that kind of pushed the edge for me here is going to be on just air yards, I guess, lost specifically from drops. And we have Bo Nix leading the way there with 292. Bryce Young, Jaden Daniels, and Jordan Love kind of rounding out that top 4. So overall, going to give the Sheesh to the rookie Bo Nix out here because, man, as great as that deep ball to Troy Franklin was, in the playoffs, they finally connected on it. Really was at a lot of situations during the season, whether it was Sutton, whether it was Troy Franklin, Devon Vele, where Nix was actually, again, even playing better than perhaps the box score suggested for stretches, just not getting a ton of help from his friends. So this is one of those situations when we look ahead to 2025, Dwain, and think about, again, where could some of these top free agents go? Who could really help their offense in the draft? Because, man, for Bo Nix to do what he did, surrounded by, let's face it, a pretty freaking dirt average supporting cast, amazing rookie year.
Yeah, I mean, he ranked 7th in scramble rate as well. So we get a guy that will use the legs on the ground. 10% design rush rate. That's still above the NFL average of 5 to 6% typically on an annual basis for NFL quarterbacks. So talking about a guy that's going to be more active on the ground and obviously just really impressed us as a passer and a perfect fit for what Sean Payton wants to do. Ian, he wants to, sustain long drives. They are willing to take the big shots down the field. As you mentioned, there were some pretty big drops here that led to a lot of air yards being lost for Bo Nix. So yeah, I'm with you, man. I'm very interested to see how the Broncos spend these dollars, how they potentially improve the receiving core. Obviously, they've got Cortland Sutton, who proved that he's worthy of being one of the top targets in the offense, but can they get a secondary weapon? And maybe the answer is let's just let Marvin Mims play more, Ian. They finally gave him that 70% route participation last week, and I know it didn't work out on the playoff game, but would love to see Mr. Mims on the field a little bit more. Certainly did maximize his opportunities down the stretch.
So I guess I can now say the opposite of congrats to all these players on winning their Sheesh for the 2024-2025 season. Dwain, can you guess, though, what the number one Sheesh moment of the season was?
Was it the Jonathan Taylor long touchdown where he drops the ball?
Number 2.
That's
that was number
2.
2. Yep,
number 2.
Number 2.
All right, what's number 1? It better be really good, Hartitz.
Championship Sunday. Chase Brown going down at the 1-yard line there at the end, injuring himself, and then watching Joe Burrow just score a touchdown the next play to render the whole thing meaningless. So remember, kids, be like Devon Achane. Score those touchdowns when you get the chance. Never know when it's going to come around again. So fun times to be had there, guys. And we'll be back with the Sheesh Report in 2025. Don't you worry. Always just reminding you how close you came to achieving all your fantasy hopes and dreams. But before we move on, I did want to give a quick shout out again to our presenting sponsor, our friends over at Mike's Hard Lemonade, because guys, the playoffs are here, and for some it's game time, while for others it is heartbreak. But hey, no matter how your season ended, Mike's Hard Lemonade is here to remind you that hard days deserve a hard lemonade. All right, Dwain, we have put a bow on the Sheeshies. Now it is time for the utilizations presented by our friends over at DraftKings. So several categories to get through here where, again, we are using your world-renowned utilization score, looking at some of the overperformers, underperformers, and guys who just kind of balled out along the way. So first things first, Dwain, let's talk about the hottest finishes from weeks 14 through 17. Obviously crucial considering that is covering the duration of the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, we'll finish the show with Mr. Utilization, which is wire-to-wire domination. But, we got to start with the end of the year, Ian, because that's how you had to win your fantasy championship, is winning in these last 4 games. And there was a lot of players that really came through in a big way. We've got young guys, old guys, but this is all based on the utilization score. And so our nominees for this award are Justin Jefferson, duh. Jamar Chase, duh. Trey McBride for the Cardinals is in there. Devontae Adams, got to get a little bit of an older player player, Brian Thomas Jr., one of our rookies on the list, Chase Brown, Sam Laporta, George Kittle, and finally Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, Jahmyr Gibbs had an 8.9 utilization score, guys. Really, the cutoff for this was a 9 or better over the last 4 games, including the Week 17 being your fantasy championship game. But I had to squeeze Jahmyr Gibbs in there, Ian, because I know he obviously helped a lot of people win a championship, even though it was an 8.9 utilization score instead of a 9.
A lot of great nominees here. And Dwain, you kind of, again, lay out in your lovely article available at fantasylife.com who exactly, ranked where in terms of raw utilization score. But you're not just actually going through and putting the man at the top of every single award. You actually have someone different for this one. So, Dwain, hottest finish from weeks 14 through 17. Who is your winner?
Yeah, I went with Brian Thomas Jr., and there's just a couple of reasons for it. Number one, if you drafted Jamar Chase, you drafted Justin Jefferson, you took them in the first 6 picks of your draft. You expected them to be doing this. Now, that doesn't take away from these guys. We'll talk about them a little bit more in a little bit, Ian. But I had to give this one to Brian Thomas Jr. because he's the biggest surprise of all the players we look at on that list. He was the lowest drafted player from an ADP standpoint, other than Chase Brown, who it took an injury for him to really come on and cement your season. So looking at Brian Thomas Jr., man, over those last 4 games, Ian, the guy comes out here and scores 25.3 fantasy points per game. If you look at Justin Jefferson, he was at 26.5, so right there with him. Jamar Chase, 26.3, so only a point away from those players. And man, if you look at his utilization over that stretch, it was absolutely dominant. He had a 37% target share, a 52% share of the air yards for the Jaguars, and he led all NFL wide receivers with 75% of the Jaguars' targets inside the end zone going to Brian Thomas Jr. So he was literally their entire passing game, playing with Mac Jones doing this, no less. So, I mean, just a very impressive thing, from the rookie, and so I had to give it to Brian Thomas Jr.
Specifically during the fantasy playoffs, weeks 15 through 17, he was the wide receiver 1 in fantasy. So certainly one heck of an end to the season. And again, doing so even without his QB1 there down the stretch. So Dwain, we discussed kind of a way too early first round ahead of 2025. I had AJ Brown in at the end of the first round ahead of Brian Thomas Jr. And, I had it there for about 10 days, but I think I can safely say now I am tired of that decision. I'm out. We're done. All right. That was a good stretch. We'll see you in round 2 though, AJB. So again, Dwain, obviously Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase at the top of this list, but was there someone that maybe wasn't such an obvious star that you did, kind of consider a runner up here to BTJ?
Oh, man, there were a lot of good names to consider here. Like, I think Chase Brown is the other one, obviously. He didn't do quite as well down the stretch, but he gave you a huge second half of your season. But, I mean, the guy had a 9.3 utilization score over those final 4 weeks. So he was definitely part of the winning equation. Came up kind of small in that final week, and he had that Sheesh moment, Ian, which I agree. That lost thousands of dollars for me personally. So I agree with that being the number one Sheesh moment of the season. Very good call by you. The other one, I think the sneaky under the radar one is Sam Laporta, because a name that really disappointed. And honestly, if you drafted Sam Laporta, you probably weren't in the fantasy playoffs. He was an early round pick and he was a bust. And if you had him plus someone else that got injured, like a McCaffrey or whatever, then that probably cost you even having a shot at the playoffs. Now, what that typically does, that means people forget about them the next year, because all they remember is, man, I took Sam Laporta early last year and he ended up killing me. So it'll be interesting to see where his ADP comes around. But this guy finished the year with a 9.3 utilization score over the final 4 games. That was just as good as George Kittle. It was only 0.2 points behind Trey McBride.
Yeah, Trey McBride just barely edged the W, specifically in weeks 15 through 17. Mentioned BTJ winning it as a wide receiver. We had Jared Goff and Jahmyr Gibbs win as quarterback and running back, respectively. So you mentioned the Chase Brown again. That individual Sheesh in week 17 sucked, but we also got to remember 2 other drives in that game. He got tackled at the 2-yard line. Truly was only a couple feet away from a 3-touchdown performance. Maybe could have won the hottest finish, but not in this simulation. And accordingly, we give our applause to Mr. Brian Thomas Jr. So great stuff there, Dwain. But now we're going to go a little bit negative here. It is time for the utilization underperformer of the year, where again, Dwain, you're looking at more than just raw, point totals of guys not doing anything. There had to be a level of expectation that was going with this underperformance as well.
Yeah, so utilization score is still a key part of this, right? So these are the utilization awards. So, we got that covered. Fantasy points per game also matter. If you guys go check out the article, it'll be up over at fantasylife.com for free. And I go into all the details around this. But then the final thing, really looking at the difference in their expected fantasy points per game based on their utilization score versus their actual. So that was the main driver. Looking, okay, you had this utilization score, you scored this many fantasy points, but how many should you have scored based on your historical comps for players in a similar range of the utilization score? And here are the nominees. George Pickens of the Steelers, Ian, he had a 7.4 utilization score, but he finished minus 1.9 versus expected. We got Tony Pollard of the Titans, DeAndre Swift, who you mentioned earlier. A lot of these Sheeshis will be coming up on this list, Ian. Breece Hall of the Jets, Travis Kelce, tight end for the Chiefs, and then finally, Garrett Wilson, Ohio State Buckeye. I had to get him on the list for you, Ian, from the Jets.
From the national championship winning Ohio State Buckeyes. Of course. That said, he will not be taking home this ring. Appreciate you, man. Nailed that one out of the park. We are talking about, again, a winner, Dwain, who, had some good moments this year, but again, relative to that overall volume was not so great. And let's face it, maybe had a couple antics along the way that pissed off his fantasy managers as well.
For sure. But here's the positive. You could look at this as being the list of players that are most likely to have positive regression next year. Mm-hmm. The challenge with George Pickens is we kind of got to peel back the layers of the onion and think about it. I will say this, talent perspective wise, Ian, he's fine. If you look at him, he finished 15th in target share, 27% this year, 44% of his team's air yards. That's a wide receiver one worthy number going back to data since 2011. And he was 10th in end zone target share. So really getting all the different ways you can get the football, he's getting it. We know that he's good with the ball in his hands. He's a contested catch guy. When he's not open, he's still really open. So I think there's still a ton of things to love about George Pickens' game and the evolution that we saw from him this season. However, our old nemesis, Arthur Smith, is still involved in. He's finding ways to crop up. Now, the Steelers ranked 25th in pass attempts, and they ranked 29th in drop back rate over expectation at minus 5%. So when you have a really run heavy team, even if you've got that 27% target share, man, it can make it really difficult. And I will say also, he and Justin Fields just didn't click. So if you just look at the games with Russell Wilson, it honestly got even a little bit better for George Pickens. So I do think that there's a silver lining here for him. I think the talent is there for Pickens, but we'll see what the offense looks like. We got quarterback questions. Obviously, Arthur Smith probably back for round 2 next year.
Could be Justin Fields back. We will see what, again, Pittsburgh is doing. Obviously, been a hole under center here for quite some time in the Big Ben era. So I want to talk a little about Breece Hall as well, Dwain, someone who, again, was right there in terms of CMC, Bijan, or Breece Hall at the top of 2024 drafts. However, at the end of the day, he finished as just the RB17 in terms of PPR points per game. And honestly, man, it felt even worse than that down the stretch. He was playing through a little bit of pain. We had Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis stepping up as well. Not a great 2024 for Breece Hall, but again, based on the numbers and just the touches he was getting, you would like to think there could be, again, some maybe light at the end of the tunnel into 2025.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. And I mean, you can tell me if you disagree, but I think we both probably view Breece Hall still as a guy that can be a true every down back, meaning he can be out there on the pass downs. He could handle the carries inside the 5-yard line. He theoretically still has that home run potential. He'll be 2 years removed from the injury next year. So definitely think there's positives. You're going to have some team environment questions around Breece Hall. But this year, I mean, it was really maddening, Ian, because every time we thought that the coaching staff had gone back to giving him that full-time role, the next week, it would go away and it would suddenly be it was like a flavor of the week kind of thing, or honestly a game plan sort of thing where Braylon Allen would get more involved. And then you mentioned Isaiah Davis really coming on at the end of the year, and both those players looked good. So it's one that we'll really have to monitor this offseason, the coaching changes, all those sort of things that are going to come into play. One way we could look at it is it's a positive, right? But the other way you could look at it is the new regime's not tied to Breece Hall. He's not their draft pick. So it's going to be really interesting to see what moves the Jets make this next year.
Obviously, life has not been easy for Brees really any step of the way. Only the Titans have actually averaged fewer rushing yards before contact per carry than the Jets over these past 3 seasons. So better luck next year, Brees, and better luck next year too. Again, the utilization underperformer of the year, Mr. George Pickens. But Dwayne, let's get a little bit more positive now and talk about the overperformer of the year. Players who maybe already had great volume, but man, their just overall ability to rack up production, rack up fantasy points really did even just over expectation. Yeah, they had a lot more than we even expected based on their utilization.
Yeah, and this is similar to the underperformers, same type of criteria. We're looking at the utilization score, how many fantasy points they scored per game versus what historical comps have done. And so the number one nominee for this category was Derrick Henry. He 6.4 points over expected based on his utilization score. We know Ian, a guy that doesn't get used that much in the passing game. And that's what holds down his utilization score. Very similar player in number 2 with David Montgomery. He had a 6.2 utilization score this year. James Cook, number 3, we're going to talk about him some more in a second. Mark Andrews, tight end for the Ravens. Man, I wrote that before the brutal game for him the other day in the championship round. And then we have Bucky Irving for the Buccaneers. And finally, Brian Thomas Jr. making another list because he really came on late in the season. So utilization score over the whole season, 7.3. So he outperformed expectations by 1.8 fantasy points per game.
You can say these men were a little bit lucky to get the production they did, or you could say they're that freaking good at football to pull off again what they managed with the limited touches. And at the end of the day, Dwayne, you mentioned it. We do have a winner. Turns out scoring 18 touchdowns, maybe you're a pretty good football player.
Yeah, and I think you just hit on something really key overall. So I've gone back and looked at these players. It's been a better list to be on than to not be on. Like last year, Achane was on it. So you have a lot of playmakers that fall into this categories. Now, you do have some players that not necessarily, but like Derrick Henry's a great example. When I see Derrick Henry as the utilization score that he does, I also know that he plays in a great offense and the dude scores touchdowns like nobody's business, right? And he's in a great scheme. We know he can hit the long ball. And we've known about Derrick Henry year after year after year, not going to be that involved in the passing game. We expect him to outperform his utilization score. David Montgomery, we talked about a little bit similar, but I decided to go with a guy here, Ian, that I think is actually the most likely to be the opposite of that. Like, I think it would be a negative regression scenario next season for this player. And it is James Cook. You know, he finished as the running back 11 on the season with 16.7 fantasy points per game. He had a 6.5 utilization score. So guys that are usually in that range, like aren't scoring anywhere near what James Cook did. He outperformed expectations, 4.5 fantasy points per game over expectation. But I chose him. That's lower than Derrick Henry's number. That's lower than David Montgomery's number. But I chose him because I really do believe when you look at the utilization and you look at his profile, it's just a bit wonky, Ian. He actually went down in multiple utilization categories. His utilization score went down and his fantasy points went up. But if you look at him, snaps went down from 55 to 48%, attempts 46% to 50%. That did go up. Attempts inside the 5-yard line is the real key though, Ian. That's the category that went up the most. And what's funny is if you would have asked people before the season, what is the one way that James Cook goes off and dominates the season? I promise you people would have told you, oh, it's the receiving game. They would have that no one was ever going to acquiesce that he was going to be the guy to get the carries inside the 5-yard line, but that's what happened. He went from 15% to 49%. But look, even less routes. His role in the passing game went down, targets went down. They're splitting this backfield up across 3 different players. So we love Buffalo. We love touchdowns. We know Buffalo's going to score touchdowns. So I'm not saying James Cook is going to suck next year, Ian, but he scored 16 rushing touchdowns this year. Even if he kept the same role that he had this year, he's not going to score 16 rushing touchdowns next year. It's just not going to happen. And then you run the risk of that they do take some of these carries because we just established how unpredictable getting the carries inside the 5-yard line is. It could easily go to Ray Davis. You could get more to a Ty Montgomery. We'll see what they do with their backfield. And then we know you got to deal with Josh Allen. So I think there's just a lot of issues here for James Cook. Not saying he's not a good player. He's shown that. He's been very explosive. He's a guy I've liked a long time. I probably over-touted James Cook. So I was so happy to see him finally come through for fantasy managers. But I think he's the guy out of this list that's at most risk of a decline in 2025.
I appreciate the Ty Montgomery slip. We are talking Ty Johnson here, who will be a free agent.
Ty Johnson.
You're good. You're
Yeah,
good. I know
same
what you're
thing.
talking about. But another running back who is pretty good in the passing game. So couldn't agree more. Again, would have really expected Cook to take a step forward as a receiver, not a step back. But yeah, it turns out when you score 18 touchdowns across the course of the season, you will be just fine. But I think what also makes this, a great call, Dwayne, is the fact that this wasn't anything like Cook during his first two seasons. He actually converted just 2.3% of his touches into scores during 2022 and 23. That was 41st among 53 qualified running backs. This last year, 7.5% of his touches went for a touchdown. That was easily first in the NFL. So again, really just a poster child for someone who probably going to find the end zone a bit less in 2025.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you want to look at the positive, the silver lining here, right? Again, we've talked about this a little bit before. It's that these smaller backs can get these workloads inside the five. I mean, Cook's just one of them. We've got Jamal Charles and Austin Eckler of yesteryear. And yes, thank you for the catch on the Ty Montgomery. You can tell I've been going back and studying the history of these players that go in these lists because Montgomery's actually a name that popped up and it popped into my head instead of Ty Johnson. So thank you. But James Cook, obviously, but Devon Achane, 0.8 carries per game inside the 5-yard line. Bucky Irving, 0.8. A lot of these smaller backs, Jahmyr Gibbs at 1 carry inside the 5-yard line per game. These guys actually came through in a big way, scoring touchdowns from in close, despite the fact that a lot of people said, hey, if you don't weigh 220 pounds, you can't do it. That is just false information. All lies, Ian.
The Bucky Irving performance especially, man, now joins Nick Chubb and Derrick Henry as the 3 now only running backs to average north of 4 yards after contact per carry in a single season. Over the last decade, man, Bucky really was special out there. And Mark Andrews, I know it feels weird to have him in an overperformer category after what happened last Sunday. Remember, though, only Jamar Chase had more touchdowns than my man's, I believe, after week 6 of the season. So really still was a nice second half from Mark Andrews. But yes, utilization overperformer of the year does indeed go to Bills running back James Cook. So still plenty of utilization goodness to get to, everyone. First, though, a quick word to our friends over at DraftKings. All right, football fans, things are getting real. Whether your team still has made it to the conference championships or not, there are still plenty of ways to enjoy the games. Get in on the action right now with my partners at DraftKings Sportsbook. They are offering all new customers $200 in bonus bets instantly after betting just $5. Don't let this slip away. Download the DraftKings app now and sign up using promo code FANTASYLIFE. The crown is yours. All right, Dwayne, we've been mixing in a little positive, a little negative, and now we are again going back to the ladder with the biggest decline of the year. And again, want to stress that throughout this, you did try to focus more so on guys that were out there, maybe not 100% healthy, who is in the NFL during any given moment, but, healthy enough to at least be on the field. And unfortunately, couldn't exactly provide the typical utilization and production goodness that we grew accustomed to seeing from them.
Yeah, absolutely. Try to avoid guys that just missed a ton of time, to your point, due to the injuries. But man, this was a not fun list because there's a lot of guys on this list that we probably drafted quite a bit in fantasy, but we have to try to learn from our mistakes. So we're going to have the award, and here are your nominees for the biggest decline. And this is year over year. And the two key things I looked at were utilization score and fantasy points in the prior season versus utilization score and fantasy points this season. Number 1, Tyreek Hill with the Dolphins. Ian went from 23.3 fantasy points per game down to 12.8. That it wasn't like the dude was just unlucky. Utilization score fell from 9.5 to 6.9. The Cheetah took a massive hit. We'll talk about it more in a minute. Rachaad White of the Buccaneers fell from 15.7 fantasy points per game to 13.7. Travis Etienne, 16.4 down to 8.8. Yuck. DJ Moore, getting a better quarterback, theoretically. No, just kidding. Went from a 17 down to 14. Sorry, producer swing. Tank Dell of the Texans, another one, a guy that I honestly touted quite a bit in the preseason. Fell from 15 fantasy points per game down to 10. Utilization score dropped from 6.7 down to 5.8.
So I think the important thing to remember with these guys, again, Tyreek Hill playing through a little bit of a wrist injury. Etienne had a little bit of an early season issue. Tank Dell, obviously a horrific season-ending injury. But again, we are looking at the games when they were, again, healthy enough to just be out there. So while Tyreek Hill, Dwayne, maybe didn't have the biggest wrist injury, maybe his quarterback injury was hurting him a bit more than, again, any of us could have realized. But, man, even down the stretch with a healthy Tua, never quite saw enough out of Mr. Tyreek Hill.
Yeah, and that's something that I dug into, and it could have gotten Tyreek excluded from the list. The challenge was he still wasn't even that good with Tua, 14.9 fantasy points per game. Now, that's way better than the 8.9 you got without Tua, but it still didn't live up to the fact that you spent a top 3 to 4 pick on this guy in your fantasy draft. You could have taken Jamar Chase. You talk about a massive swing, a player that scored 23.7 fantasy points per game in Jamar Chase, and you took a guy that scored 12.8 over the season, and for a large chunk of it was 9 points a game. Couldn't even be in your freaking fantasy lineup. That's a massive hit. So that kept him on this list because he still would have been a massive disappointment even with Tua. And then the other concern here, Ian, is, like I mentioned, not just the fantasy points going down, but the fact that his underlying utilization also fell over the first 2 seasons with Miami. He notched 31 and 33% target shares. That fell to 22% as Jonnu Smith and Devon Achane became more involved. And you could argue that, look, I mean, Hill was out there a lot of times without Waddle or a banged up Jalen Waddle. So he actually had less target competition in some of these games, but it just did not work out for him. Now, I would say the silver lining is you could say, well, you know what? Jalen Waddle really did suffer the same fate, in his healthy games. He was also worthless in fantasy football. Tyreek Hill was worth more than Jalen Waddle this year. Obviously, you got Waddle at a cheaper price in your fantasy drafts, but neither one of these guys came through. It was really Achane and Jonnu Smith that outperformed expectations, that drug the other 2 guys down. So there also could just be an issue here where the offense, Ian, or where the National Football League has caught on to Mike McDaniel. They've caught on. And if you look at it, as more and more teams copy what he did to make that offense, kind of evolutionary, defenses have seen it more. So they're used to this motion. They're used to the speed motion. They're used to the alignments. They're used to you doing these things from under center and heavy formations. A lot of the things that were cheat codes over the last 2 to 3 seasons for the Dolphins, it does appear that the league is catching up. And so I also wonder if that's playing a role with the decline we saw for these 2 players in Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle.
Hopefully McDaniel is in the lab working up a counterpunch. But yeah, man, look, when Tua came back under center, the passing game was much more efficient. But you said it, they were going through Achane and Jonnu far more than we ever could have imagined. And ultimately, weeks 8 through 17 down the stretch, Tyreek Hill, just the wide receiver 21 in PPR points per game. Again, such a far cry from the man we drafted to be maybe the overall wide receiver 1 in fantasy. So did want to shout out the 2 running backs on this list, though, Dwain, because I don't think there's anything easier to kind of tell, a decline or just a difference in players than when they're being outproduced in the exact same offense behind the exact same offensive line. And that was the case for Rachaad White, who straight up lost his job to Bucky Irving by the end of the season, and Travis Etienne, who had to deal with Tank Bigsby, again, putting up all kinds of big numbers. And especially, man, in Bigsby's case, this wasn't the sort of scat back, number 2 player always facing all these lighter boxes. When Bigsby was on the field for Travis Etienne, defenses should have been well aware that there was a better chance he was going to run the football. And yet, Dwain, couldn't be a bigger difference between what these guys were able to do on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, Bucky Irving was the better back than Rachaad White, really across the board. And then the same thing for Tank Bigsby over Travis Etienne. Now, Etienne did battle some injuries, so that's something that was in play here. But just looking at Rachaad White, he was the runner-up for this. So had Tua, in his absence, been able to kind of bail Tyreek out from being on the list, it would have been Rachaad White as the biggest decliner. And honestly, of the list, the guy that I'm probably the least interested in right now in fantasy drafts heading into next year, it's him, just because Bucky Irving looked so much better. And I think he can do everything that Rachaad White does and do it better.
White might just be a straight up handcuff at this point. What a time to be alive. All due respect to Sean Tucker as well in that equation. So we'll sort out that Tampa Bay backfield as the course of the offseason gets going. But Dwain, not done here, because it is now time for, I think, my favorite category you put together. It is the Fugazi of the year. People that, again, maybe had the production that had them popping up in waiver wire articles, but if you dug just a little bit beneath the surface, Dwain, utilization score never quite matched up in the numbers that we were seeing in the box score.
Yeah, and that's the real key. These are guys that fooled us, Ian, into putting them into our lineups. And kind of the way I went about determining who the winner of the category was going to be is which one was most likely to keep fooling us to where it lasted longer and we continue to go with it. So the nominees for this award, Jayden Reed, wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers. If you were reading the utilization report this year, hopefully you guys were. Nick Westbrook-Akini was a regular in the Fugazi area of the column. In fact, at one point, point, I did start to doubt myself, Ian, and be like, am I just going to have to take this guy out of the Fugazi section? It did eventually end for Westbrook-Ikhine. Couldn't keep scoring a touchdown every game, Ian. And then Marquez Valdez-Scantling. There were a lot of other guys. Mac Holland, Mr. No Shoes. Thank God he doesn't wear shoes. He's really not that good at football, guys. Good blocker, not a good receiver, but the no shoes thing, man, I got to say, hat tip to you, Mac Hollins, for making the most of your opportunity in that fashion. So other names that didn't quite make the list, but for this one, Ian, who would you choose as the winner? And we'll see if it matches who I have.
I'm just saying, Dwayne, for you to really go against the national movement, the international stardom that Nick Westbrook-Ikhine managed to gain 9 touchdowns and freaking 32 catches is just so incredible. But the thing is, I understand, because you brought up the original point. Like, these were guys who actually fooled you. We were here every single Sunday night. Nick Westbrook-Ikhine scored another touchdown. And even as someone who was begging you to raise him up the ranks, I could barely get him inside the top 50. So while, again, I wanted to shout out, the artist known as NWI, I think he got the winner right here.
Yeah, and it's Jayden Reed, and this one's painful, Ian, because it's a guy that is going into year 2, part of an offense that we like with the Packers. They have multiple weapons there, but no one to really stand in the way, right? That's just dominating the targets. And Jayden Reed was a guy that we saw flash big as a rookie, and man, did he hook the hook right in on us right away this season. Over the first 4 games of the year, averaging 19.4 fantasy points per game. So when you get a young player like this breaking out, that's where it's really hard to get away from them. And so I don't know about you, but I continued getting start-sit questions around Jayden Reed. We were in week 13 and 14, and people were still on the hook for putting this player in their lineup. He should have been long gone. What's interesting is even when he had that breakout over the first 4 games, guys, the utilization score of 6.6 told us that the range of outcomes, it was going to be very rare for him to be able to keep up that performance that he was on. Utilization score said he was more likely a low-end wide receiver 2 at best, and most likely a wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 4. Just never was able to separate from the competition on his team as far as earning targets. Now, it didn't help that when the Packers go to 2 wide receivers, Ian, for whatever reason, they think Jayden Reed can't be one of the 2 guys on the field, which I don't quite get. So that hurt him. But it doesn't matter what you and I think. All that matters is what the coaching staff thinks, and they just didn't give him enough playing time. We had games where he was only out there 60% of the pass plays, and that's just really hard to overcome.
And just weird games, too, where he just wasn't even getting designed a couple of touches throughout the game, Dwayne. I understand we can't give every single receiver out here, 10 or 12 targets per week. You got to be special to get that. But, yeah, week 14, 0 touches, 1 target over the course of a 60-minute football game against the Lions, for crying out loud. Overall, guys, Jayden Reed was the wide receiver 10 during the first 8 weeks of the season. Wide receiver, though, 47 from weeks 9 through week 17. So truly was killing your lineup if you, again, were still trying to stick it out with him. So I do like seeing Marquez Valdez-Scantling down this list as well, Dwayne, because it was just so random, because you see MVS throughout his career. He gets to play with Aaron Rodgers. Oh, this is fantastic. And he goes spend some years with Patrick Mahomes. And then to start this year, okay, he's with Josh Allen. Maybe this could work out. No, Dwayne. Derek Carr was the man who truly got the most out of MVS at the end of the day.
Yeah, man. MVS, he's just a real treat. It's literally a touchdown or nothing. Are you getting a 60-yard play with a touchdown, or are you getting 0 targets with 0? Or you might get 1 target that was down the field and it was off target, right? You get some air yards out of it, Ian. But like you always say, air yards don't score as fantasy points. So yeah, MVS was he wasn't quite like NWI. It's funny we get the 2 guys, the NWI, MVS on this list together. He didn't string multiple back to back to back, but man, when he came through, they were big enough to just make you think, okay, do I just give MVS a spin, especially Ian, if you played in a skank league?
That is true. I will say, on my 32-team waiver wire, MVS was a hot commodity out there. So credit to our, again, nominees. But again, Fugazi of the year is going to be Green Bay Packers wide receiver Jayden Reed. Hopefully they scheme me up some more consistent touches next year, my man. So 2 more categories to get to, Dwayne. First, though, a quick word from our friends over at Bud Light.
Sunday. Time to suit up.
Seem like half zips, kind of quarter zip.
And sacrifice your body.
This is fun.
Because no matter how hard you football, it's easy to Sunday.
All right, Dwayne, time for our most improved player without injury assistance. So, yes, I understand if you want to look at just first half versus second half splits, you're going to see Chase Brown rising up the fantasy point leaderboard in a hurry. But of course, he didn't get that full-time role without a big assist from Zach Moss landing on IR with that neck injury. So your focus here was, again, looking at the guys who really rose up throughout the year, but more so on their own accord.
Yeah, absolutely. So without an injury assist, if you will, and it's just like the biggest drop-off award we talked about, looking at their utilization score and their fantasy points per game from the previous season versus this season. So that's why you won't hear rookies' names on the list, even though they may have improved this year. This is a year-over-year improvement score. And the nominees are number 1, Trey McBride. Ian, he went from 10.7 fantasy points per game to 15.6, but the utilization score came along with it. Chuba Hubbard of the Panthers. Ian, I thought you would like this. You would give a hat tip to the fact that I did not forget Chuba Hubbard on this list. Utilization went from 6.5 to 8.5. Drake London for the Falcons went from 10.8 fantasy points per game to 16.5. Kenneth Walker, man, a guy I know we don't talk about as much, but early in the season, oh my God, Kenneth Walker was in a full-time role for the Seahawks. Then we have Cortland Sutton, who made a big improvement. T. Higgins, Jackson Smith, and Jigba, and Jamison Williams, two guys that made the biggest improvement just raw number-wise were JSN and Jamison Williams. Obviously didn't reach the same heights as some of these other names on the list, but man, both guys made massive strides forward in their game in 2023 versus 2024.
I know you have your winner, Dwayne. I do want to give a quick shout out, though, to Cortland Sutton, because this was a guy who, again, kind of the last couple of years readily been available on that wide receiver 4 borderline and pretty much left for dead. After he had that just infamous goose egg with 0 targets on Thursday Night Football. But weeks 9 through 17, the overall wide receiver 11 in PPR points, going to show that, again, I'm probably not going to rank him inside my top 10, maybe even top 15 wide receivers, but still very much had an awesome season as Bo Nix is number 1. But again, Dwayne, he is not winning this award. That man is.
Yeah, that winner is Trey McBride. Ian, this was number 1. This was a hard list, honestly, to dwindle down, period, just to get to the list of the nominees. And it was one of the longer lists that you guys heard today. There were so many other guys like Terry McLaurin not making this list. That tells you how hard it was because he had a great season. Cortland Sutton, who you mentioned, he honestly, you would think just hearing the name that he should be the winner, but his utilization score only went up from 6.4 to 7.8. So honestly, quarterback was huge for Cortland Sutton. But man, this was a situation where it was so hard to get it down. The final 2 guys, though, were for me were Trey McBride and T. Higgins. So T. Higgins was actually my runner-up in this category. Technically, Jackson Smith and Jigba and Jamison Williams were the most improved on a raw number standpoint, if you just look at their utilization and fantasy scores. But again, didn't reach the same heights in utilization score and fantasy points per game as we got from Trey McBride and T. Higgins. So when you look at McBride, man, he improved his utilization score by 2.3. So 33% improvement year over year. And his fantasy points also followed along. Obviously, ended up being a absolute smash for you, Ian, if you had him on your fantasy team. Real quick on Higgins, he also did improve. He went from a 6.2, he went up as well 54%. So if you look at his utilization score, and he's a guy that's been around a while, right? So, you don't always expect to get those kind of massive jumps. So seeing T. Higgins do what he did, that was definitely an eye-opener. Really interested to see if the Bengals can keep him or he moves on. But ultimately, again, back to Trey McBride, finishes the year as the tight end to 15.6 fantasy points per game. Higgins obviously was still really good, Ian, 18.7 points per game. But if you look at McBride, I ultimately went with him because he just did it over a larger sample of games. He did this over 16 games. My cutoff to be included was 12 games. That's right at the line. That's where T. Higgins was for the season. But Trey McBride also, when we look at his utilization score, he came in at a 9.3. He bested Brock Bowers for that, who came in at 9.1. And he also was better than longtime stays like we know Travis Kelce as well as George Kittle, who came in at 8.8 with their utilization score. So Trey McBride, it was a tough decision, but he narrowly edged out T. Higgins.
Again, the overall tight end 1 specifically in the fantasy playoffs as well in terms of total PPR points. So really throughout the entire season, it was just one week after another. How can McBride be scoring this many points without catching a freaking touchdown? Well, he goes ahead and actually scores a touchdown in each of his final 2 games, now on a streak. Hopefully he and Kyler can keep that momentum ahead, of 2025. So great stuff there, and congrats to Trey McBride for our most improved without injury assistance utilization player of the year. But now, Dwayne, it is time time for the grand finale. Mr. Utilization Score, again, this is your baby. So accordingly, your MVP basically of the season is going to go to one of these guys.
Yeah, and so this is just a wire-to-wire thing. You know, we're looking at your utilization score at the end of the year. And now the cool thing about the utilization score is games that you miss, we're not counting against you, right? So if you didn't get targets in a game because you weren't healthy enough to play, we don't count that against your target share. So we really tried to level the playing field for the awards. But essentially, man, you had to be a 9.0 or higher. Guys, remember the utilization score is a 0 to 10. So 10 being the absolute best score. And the nominees for Mr. Utilization are Ja'Marr Chase, who had a 9.4 top utilization score of the season across all positions, Ian. Alvin Kamara coming in at 9.3. A lot of people want to forget about Alvin Kamara, but you just can't. Trey McBride, who we just talked about as the most improved player, at 9.3. Bijan Robinson going from 8.1 up to 9.1. Big step up for Bijan as well. Brock Bowers had a 9.1 as a rookie. And then Malik Neighbors, another rookie, to round out the top or the finalists here with a 9.0 utilization score.
At the end of the day, though, there can only be one Dwain. And, you know, I do think it is fairly obvious who that one is.
Yeah, it's Ja'Marr Chase. Look, the guy that if you took him, you got 23.7 fantasy points per game in a PPR. The guy won the freaking triple crown out here, only the sixth wide receiver to ever do it. Look, he did everything. And when you look at Ja'Marr Chase, Ian, the interesting part is, like, not only was he the highest utilization score of this season at a 9.4 overall, this is his second time to lead all wide receivers. He had a 9.7 utilization score in 2022. So I don't think I have to belabor this one that long. To your point, you guys know Ja'Marr Chase was out there getting targets, earning air yards, earning touchdown, earning end zone targets. And guess what? He was doing a lot with those opportunities, which obviously is a major factor in also winning the award, because the utilization score does include fantasy points per game as a small part of the equation, Ian. So we want guys not only getting the opportunity, but maximizing the opportunities. And did anyone in the NFL maximize their opportunities more than Ja'Marr Chase this season? I think not.
Just incredible company to be in now. 2024 Ja'Marr Chase, 2021 Cooper Kupp, 2005 Steve Smith, 1992 Sterling Sharp, and 1990 Jerry Rice, the only Triple Crown winners since the freaking 60s. So again, can't say enough great things about Ja'Marr Chase's season and everyone else here. And I do like seeing Alvin Kamara actually get a little bit of love, Dwayne, because this was a guy largely written off. I think he was RB16, RB17, in preseason ADP. And yes, I understand ending the season on the sideline, unfortunate injuries. Wasn't always great when we had, kind of that just backup offensive line in there, one bad quarterback after another after Derek Carr went down. But you look up at the end of the year, man, and Alvin Kamara was a top 5 running back in actual fantasy points per game.
Yeah, man, 18.9 fantasy points per game over a 14-game stretch. And the 10 games he actually got to play with Derek Carr, he averaged 20.4. So when he had competent quarterback play, he was even better. To your point, people are going to remember the rough finish, but a lot of that wasn't due to him. The injuries were piling up for the Saints overall. He was dealing with injuries. I think the thing you got to look at is the guy continued to get those targets, Ian, and that is just an absolute cheat code, even on a terrible offense like the Saints, to be able to do what Alvin Kamara did. Not as good as he used to be, but still a very impressive utilization score, and the fantasy points followed. The other name, I would shout out really quickly is Bijan Robinson. Man, I mean, He went from an 8.2 to a 9.1 utilization score. His fantasy points per game went from 14.8 last season to 19.9. And man, he finished the year on a heater. If you had him on your team over the last 8 games, you were loving Bijan Robinson. Elite talent, now getting that elite workload.
Understand why Saquon, Henry, even Gibbs got a little bit more of the national spotlight over Bijan, just based on what they were doing as well. But yeah, guys, Bijan Robinson's, again, sophomore season, truly impressive stuff as well. But again, Mr. Utilization Score, Ja'Marr Chase, congrats to him and the rest of our award winners. We are not done giving away awards though, Dwayne. We're going to have the official Fantasy Life Awards, the berries, if you will, here tomorrow on our show, going through the Fantasy MVP, best championship game performance, all that and so much more. So make sure you guys tune back in for that one. For now, though, for Dwayne, for producer Matt, for producer Kelsey, I'm Ian. Thanks again for tuning into the Fantasy Live Show. And until next time, take care, everybody.